While sci-fi movies were all the rage in the 1950s, it's interesting to note that Hollywood, generally speaking, was never too invested in them. The small scale was incredibly profitable, but big-budget science fiction was seen as a big gamble. One of the only film producers who managed to convince the studios to shell out the big bucks was George Pal, the man who launched the sci-fi boom with the spectacular Destination Moon. Pal followed it up with When Worlds Collide and The War of the Worlds, two more big-screen spectacles that earned critical and financial success. But as anyone in Hollywood knows, a hot streak can't last forever.
Conquest of Space!
From the vantage point of a rotating station in orbit around the Earth, mankind has set its sights on our nearest planetary neighbor, the desolate Mars. The recently promoted General Samuel Merritt takes a crew of 5 other men, including his own son and a stowaway sergeant, through the perils of space on a long and difficult journey to the Red Planet. However, the rigors of space prove to be too much for the General, and as his sanity slips, he sabotages the mission and must be stopped before these men are lost to the heavens.
Before we go any further, if you could please hit that like button, we might just be able to continue our exploration of the great unknown. If you really do like this video, please subscribe as well. Thank you in advance. With that out of the way, let's get back to the subject at hand. In 1949, the German emigre and scientist Willy Ley wrote a speculative book about the exploration of the solar system entitled The Conquest of Space, with illustrations by sci-fi icon Chesley Bonestell. After working on Destination Moon and When Worlds Collide with Bonestell, George Pal, at the suggestion of Ley himself, envisioned a film adaptation of the book, a whirlwind tour of the planets brought to life by special effects. However, when Destination Moon became a success, Paramount Pictures hired him not to produce his ambitious solar system project, but rather to make When Worlds Collide and The War of the Worlds, two intellectual properties that had been sitting in their stable for over a decade. It was only through the success of those other films that Powell was finally able to convince Paramount to go ahead with his other idea, but even though he got the green light, Paramount was uneasy about the idea of a loosely plotted, semi-realistic big-budget movie about space. As such, the studio insisted on a pared-down plot involving a manned mission to Mars, and several different writers worked on the script, including Barry Lyndon, Phil Jordan, George Worthing Yates, and James O'Hanlon. To direct, Pal brought in Byron Haskin, who had worked with Pal before on The War of the Worlds and The Naked Jungle. Much as he had done for Destination Moon, George Pal opted to use relative unknowns for the cast. The lead of Captain Barney Merritt is played by Eric Fleming, a few years before he'd land the starring role in Rawhide, and Barney's father, General Samuel Merritt, is played by Walter Brooke, a character actor who would later become famous for saying one word in The Graduate.
Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
Comedian and future Laverne and Shirley regular Phil Foster plays Sergeant Siegel, the Chinese-American actor Benson Fong plays the Japanese Sergeant Emoto, Wild Wild West's Ross Martin has his feature film debut as the ill-fated Sergeant Fodor, and Rosemary Clooney, the mother of Miguel Ferrer and aunt to George Clooney, appears in a clip from 1953's Here Come the Girls. Principal photography on Conquest of Space was done in about a month at the tail end of 1953, and a significant amount of time was devoted to the special and visual effects well into 1954. There had briefly been plans to film it in 3D, but those plans were scrapped when the budget ballooned to roughly $1.5 million, a hefty sum in those days for a science fiction feature. There were some reshoots towards the end of 1954, in which a few of Benson Fong's lines were changed, and there was consistent friction between George Pal and the studio, specifically the film's associate producer, Frank Freeman Jr., the son of Paramount's head of production. Though the exact details of that friction are lost to history, Powell would later blame Freeman for ruining the film. The music was put together by Nathan Van Cleve, fresh off of doing the score for White Christmas. Van Cleve's dramatic and string-heavy score is one of the movie's highlights, doing away with the experimental instrumentations that were all the rage in sci-fi at the time. He also wrote a lyrical march called Up, 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 but for whatever reasons, it was cut from the film. However, the biggest draw was, of course, the effects, done under the supervision of the legendary John P. Fulton. Using scale models largely designed by the rocket scientist Wernher von Braun and traveling mats lovingly made by Chesley Bonestell, the visuals were incredibly ambitious, far exceeding the scope of any of George Pal's previous effects-heavy films. Granted, the compositing is pretty sloppy and the effects haven't aged particularly well, but considering the sheer number and complexity of these shots, they are impressive for the day. While we're stopped, let me just take a minute to thank my patrons. Their support really makes this channel possible, so please, if you like these videos, consider joining my Patreon to get access to bonus content, vote on future topics, and more. You can also give me a one-time contribution by clicking on the thanks button below. Also, if you want even more content from me, I'm the co-host of a couple of different podcasts, The Streaming Heap and From Here to Paternity, which are available wherever you get your podcasts, and I have a novel called Paradox that is available through Amazon. If all else fails, though, you can always check out my website at emcgill.com, where you'll find written reviews of plenty more sci-fi classics in both film and literature. Now then, with all that shameless self-promotion out of the way, let's move on. Given the total time, money, and effort put into the movie, it's surprising that Paramount didn't give Conquest of Space an enormous marketing push. It released in March of 1955 to mixed reviews and a disastrous box office of around $1 million. George Pal was very disillusioned by the film and never produced another movie for Paramount, and Conquest of Space is only remembered today as one of his biggest mistakes. This reputation kind of does him a disservice, though. I'm not going to sit here and try to convince you that Conquest of Space is a great film or anything. It is a deeply flawed one, to be sure, but I think it should be respected for its aspirations. As much as I love sci-fi cinema of the 1950s, there were very few big-screen attempts to make scientifically grounded, serious science fiction. Conquest of Space is a spiritual predecessor to movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey, and George Pal was well ahead of his time in terms of what he was trying to accomplish. Granted, the film is all over the place. The dialogue is cringy, the acting is pretty weak, and some of the filmmaking choices are downright baffling. The science is a bit of a mixed bag too. I can appreciate how it doesn't put aliens on Mars like every other such movie in Hollywood at the time, but it does make it snow there. Still, there are kernels of interesting ideas in the story, such as the religious angle. While it comes completely out of nowhere when the general suddenly snaps and turns into a zealot for no readily apparent reason outside of space madness.
Somatic dysphagia, self-induced inability of the nerves to transmit brain messages. In your language, space fatigue.
The idea that space is the domain of God and shouldn't be invaded by man is a promising thematic angle that could have been explored more coherently. You can see how in something like, say, Event Horizon.
You don't believe in that kind of stuff, do you?
Whoever sent that message, he sure believes in hell.
Back before the space race started in earnest, there was indeed a deep theological discussion among various Judeo-Christian thinkers about the subject, with passages of the Bible used both in support and in contradiction to the idea that man's dominion should be restricted to the earth. That question is still occasionally explored in certain circles today, though it definitely isn't as prominent as it once was.
This taking of other planets, it's almost like an act of blasphemy.
But why? They belong to no one else.
Using this as a tenuous foothold, the movie tries to justify the spirit of exploration in a number of ways, like in Emoto's earnest and quasi-racist speech about Japan being made up of small people in paper houses in need of resources.
It was bad. I do not defend it.
But it never commits to it, never lets the hero confront the villain over a central philosophical question about whether mankind has the right to spread to the stars. This could be used as a metaphor for colonialism versus independence, science versus religion, or even something as simple as a son trying to get out of the shadow of his father. But the script is just too messy to get to any of those places. Regular viewers will know I'm stubbornly neutral on the subject of remakes. I don't have the knee-jerk reaction a lot of people seem to have in which a remake of a science fiction classic is automatically a bad idea, but I will admit that most remakes, not all, but most, tend to be, at the very least, weaker than the original. Personally, I think the most fertile ground for a remake would be in redoing a flawed movie with a significant amount of potential. And that's where I think a remake of Conquest of Space might actually work. Especially in the modern age where real-life scientists and engineers are working on how to get human boots on the surface of Mars. Unfortunately, as far as I can tell, this is one of the few movies I've covered that doesn't appear to have a remake in some stage of development. If you're listening, Hollywood, I might consider writing one, though I doubt you could afford me. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. What's your favorite movie about Mars? Let me know in the comments, and while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you for watching, and until next time when a 12-year-old boy will be kidnapped by an alien Pee-wee Herman, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love, as long as you're not hurting anybody.
Voyage is a cursed abomination. If it were possible, I'd come back now, return the ship to Earth, and blow it up!